All right, here's your last question. What was the cause of the Civil War? Just say slavery.
Welcome again, folks, to the Washington Babylon podcast. This week, Ken is off in parts unknown for upcoming journalism. As such, I, Andrew Stewart, am your host this week and bring you an interview with the prolific historian Dr. Gerald Horne about his latest book, White Supremacy Confronted. Dr. Horne, you've previously written in your book about communist city councilman from Harlem, Ben Davis, about undermining some of the historiography of what it could be called the mainstream Communist Party USA history regarding an arc where after the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, there was a significant drop-off in membership and the party was never the same. And I wanted to start off talking with that because I think in America particularly, and in the global north in general, you see a notion of internationalism that's really wed to these kind of romantic notions of the Communist International, the early days of the Comintern's policy, and the South African Solidarity Movement brings a different kind of lens to what internationalism and communist solidarity can look like.
Well, that's true. In this book, White Supremacy Confronted, U.S. Imperialism and Anti-Communism versus the Liberation of Southern Africa from Rhodes to Mandela, one of the points that I stress is the indispensable role of the then socialist camp led by the then Soviet Union in providing aid to the liberation fighters of Southern Africa. I dare say that given the fact that apartheid and colonialism in the sub-region, that is to say Southern Africa, was backed avidly and enthusiastically by U.S. imperialism and its North Atlantic allies, that if the socialist camp had not intervened the way it did, we still might be faced with apartheid and colonialism today. Now, you may know that I did a lot of research at Fort Hare University in South Africa, which is the equivalent of Howard University in Washington, D.C. That is to say, it's a historically black institution, the alma mater of Nelson Mandela, Robert Mugabe, and many other leaders. And in the ANC archives at Fort Hare University, it's clear that the socialist camp provided weapons for the militants to fight against apartheid and colonialism. They provided scholarships for higher education. They provided health care in terms of people being having various ailments or being wounded. They provided rest and sanatoriums. For example, Sochi on the Black Sea, which now seems to be a favorite spot for current Russian President Vladimir Putin. And they provided all-around aid to ensure that these fighters would not be left high and dry. And then, of course, the turning point in terms of the liberation of Southern Africa came in 1975 when Cuban troops, under the direction of then Cuban President Fidel Castro Ruz, were dispatched to the battlefield and administered a shellacking to the apartheid military, to the point where, number one, there was a real fear in Pretoria, and at that point, also in what was then called Rhodesia, and throughout the sub-region, that Cuban troops would forcibly eject the racists from power, which concentrated their minds wonderfully and made them more susceptible to sweet reason and negotiation. Secondly, the Cuban intervention, in the words of Henry Kissinger, the then U.S. Secretary of State, was traumatizing for U.S. imperialism and its North Atlantic allies, which caused them to redouble their efforts to dismantle the entire socialist camp. It's not coincidental that Nelson Mandela is freed and the ANC and their South African Communist Party allies are unbanned in February 1990, a few weeks after the crumbling of the Berlin Wall in November 1989, because, as quoted in the book, the last apartheid ruler, F.W. de Klerk, judged, I have to say, reasonably, that the ANC and its allies would be weakened with the apparent crumbling of the socialist camp, and therefore an agreement could be hammered out against a weakened ANC that might not be possible otherwise. And I would go a step further to say some of the problems that the ANC has had over the last 25 years, since the first democratic elections in April, May 1994, is precisely because of the fact that their bulwark of support, that is to say the socialist camp, was weakened simultaneously with the coming to power of the ANC itself.
And another aspect of the socialist camp's involvement that you've brought up here, and you also bring up in an earlier memoir you wrote in 2011, it was titled One Historian's Journey, was the Sino-Soviet split and the way that impacted solidarity with Southern Africa, and also the ironies of how Maoism as a current impacted American Black Power politics. And I was wondering if you could provide some thoughts on that.
Well, that's a very intriguing subject, is it not? It's apparent that U.S. imperialism overdetermined Moscow, which led to the Entente with China in the early 1970s, pursuant to journeys to Beijing by then U.S. President Richard M. Nixon and his aide, Henry Kissinger, which led to massive direct foreign investment in China, which has created this juggernaut that bids fair to leave U.S. imperialism sprawling in the dust. Therefore, the trade war engineered by the 45th U.S. president in May 2019, because as he surveyed the landscape and he took a peek at the Made in China 2025 pact, which suggests that China will be the world leader in robotics, green energy, quantum computing, and artificial intelligence. And footnote, Vladimir Putin has suggested that whoever takes the lead in artificial intelligence will be well on their way to being the leader of the international community. And so the 45th U.S. president felt that he had no alternative but to try to thwart China's seemingly inexorable rise. This leads me to two historical points. It's very striking that if you look at the history of British colonialism, which I've also written about, it seemed that British colonialism and the British Empire also overdetermined Moscow. That was the import of the Crimean War in the 1850s, this conflict between, among others, Great Britain and Russia. This was the import of London support for Tokyo's earth-shaking shellacking of Russia during the War of 1905, a true turning point in world history, which, of course, backfired spectacularly on December 7th, 8th, 1941, when, in a real sense, Japan fundamentally destroyed the British Empire. That is to say, with its attack on Hong Kong, now a special administrative region of the People's Republic of China, and Singapore. By the way, you should take a peek at the opening scenes of the Hollywood movie Paradise Rhodes, starring Glenn Close, which depicts the Japanese attack on Singapore. It's quite a scene, I must say. In any case, this overdetermination of Moscow seems to be a salient factor in terms of the retreat of the North Atlantic powers. But China, I'm afraid to say, also carried water for U.S. imperialism in Southern Africa in terms of its support for UNITA, the renegade faction in Angola, backed by apartheid South Africa and U.S. imperialism. Jonas Savimbi, the late leader of UNITA, was Ronald Wilson Reagan's favorite African. He was a comrade of Paul Manafort, now doing hard time on Rikers Island. Recall that he was the campaign chair for a while for Donald J. Trump in the summer of 2016. And it's also striking to note that I'm afraid to say that many of our black nationalist friends were seduced and traduced by their fascination with the People's Republic of China. The most charitable explanation I can come up with, and actually in a sense it's strange credulity, which I fairly well realized, is that they might have thought China was a replay of the 1940s. You know, I did this book, Facing the Rising Sun, African Americans, Japan, and the Rise of Afro-Asian Solidarity, which talks about the Black American fascination with Tokyo. And perhaps they thought that the rise of Miles China was a replay of those days, which, of course, is problematic on many different levels, and I won't digress as to how. But in any case, this leads directly to what I call a Pan-African debacle. That is to say, in the spring of 1974, you had a number of black Americans who were in exile in Tanzania, a frontline state in Southeast Africa, who were detained by the Tanzanian authorities with weapons. Now, the Tanzanians thought that they were trying to engineer some sort of coup against the government. I don't think that that's the case. I think it's more that they were trying to smuggle weapons to UNITA in Angola and got caught. I should also digress on another point. I'm writing a book on the 1500s right now. And one of the reasons why we are presently in North America communicating in language English developed in Northwest Europe as opposed to speaking Spanish. Of course, Spain had the first mover's advantage because they sponsored Christopher Columbus, the slaver and war criminal, in terms of his encounter with the Americans, or perhaps speaking Turkish, since Ottoman Turkey was really the major superpower of the 1500s, or not even being here at all, is that England, the way it rose to power, was that in the context of these religious conflicts, not only Protestant versus Catholic, but Christian versus Muslim and Christian versus Jewish, etc., London basically cut deals with the Ottoman Turks against Catholic Spain. And London cut deals with Morocco in particular, which was a major power of that era. People oftentimes forget to use a phrase of the 45th president. People didn't know that, as Trump might say. And that helped to catapult London to power. And I have to say, when I'm writing this, and I'm writing it now, I have sort of eerie echoes of what's happening now with China in the passing lane after working out these deals with U.S. imperialism. It seems to be at least a faint echo of what London did in the 1500s to catapult itself into the front rank of nations after basically being on the fringes of power and the fringes of Europe in a very real sense until the 17th century, which is the subject of my book, The Apocalypse of Settler Colonialism. I should also mention that it's not just the black nationalists who stubbed their toe with regard to Southern Africa. The NAACP, as we know, decided to surrender to anti-communism, although it's very interesting you have some defenders, including some historians whose names I won't mention, who take the anomalous position that the NAACP could be anti-communist at home, could be hostile to Robeson, William Patterson, Ben Davis, etc. But somehow they were not hostile to the South African Communist Party. I mean, that basically barely passes the giggle test. It's ludicrous. And as I detail by digging into the NAACP records at the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C., is that they were trying to flip the ANC leadership, which was in a close and tight alliance with the South African Communist Party. In fact, I'm not the first historian to point out that for a good deal of its political life, Nelson Mandela himself was a militant of the South African Communist Party. And the NAACP leaders, led by Walter White, the then leader, and Ralph Bunche, the former Howard University professor, Nobel laureate, United Nations official, tried but did not succeed in turning the ANC leadership into anti-communist the way that the NAACP leadership turned out to be.
You mentioned Cuba, and there's been a lot of interesting scholarship from historians like Piero Gleijeses in regards to the role of Cuba's internationalism and how much autonomy or difference it had with Moscow during the Khrushchev period. What's your take on the way that Cuba behaved and in relation to Moscow? Was it truly united, or was there some jostling and fractious debate?
I think it was both. I mean, certainly they were united on the ultimate goal of ousting the apartheid rulers from power and ousting Portuguese colonialism from Angola and Mozambique and ousting the minority regime in what became Zimbabwe. But, you know, they didn't necessarily always agree. As a matter of fact, I suspect that future scholarship will suggest that Moscow was not necessarily even happy about this Cuban intervention because, as I said, it did cause trauma in Washington. It did lead to Washington redoubling its efforts to dismantling the entire socialist camp, which they then proceeded to do. And so I don't think we should necessarily be surprised that there was differences of opinion, shall we say, or I think future scholarship will suggest that there were differences of opinion between Moscow and Washington. And of course, there were differences of opinion on a number of different issues, the differences of opinion even with regard to Africa policy. For example, the Western Sahara issue, which is still a burning issue. This is a former Spanish colony that is occupied in a improper manner by the Algerians. You know, with the Cubans being much more willing to support Polisario, the national liberation movement of Western Sahara, much more enthusiastically than, shall we say, Moscow did during that same period. So, you know, that's one of the reasons this country is falling behind. I mean, you have to spend so much time rebutting nonsense that you can't get to real issues. And that's... and let me return to another issue, that previous question that you asked. That is to say, China also was very useful to U.S. imperialism in the late 1980s and 1990s when there was the Japanic. Recall that there was this fear that Japan was in the passing lane. That was a time when supposedly the imperial palace in Tokyo was worth more than everything in the state of California. And that's when Hollywood began to produce movies like Rising Sun with Sean Connery and Wesley Snipes. Have you seen that movie?
I remember it.
Yeah, you should see it. It's very interesting. And it reflects that hysteria about Japan being in the passing lane. And of course, just like U.S. imperialism was very adroit in terms of encircling the socialist camp, supported by Japan, China, South Korea, the European Union, you know, starting a brush fire in Afghanistan etc. When Japan seemed like it was making its move, well, China, which of course has a historic bone to pick with Japan, because as you know, there was the war waged in China by Japanese imperialism in the 1930s and up to 1945, and it's the Chinese Communist Party's role in beating back the Japanese invaders that still, to a certain extent, helps to determine their legitimacy to rule. And so China, as I said, it carried a lot of water for U.S. imperialism. And, I know this is a very sensitive subject because I don't want to necessarily inadvertently contribute to this anti-China hysteria that's beginning to course through this country and affecting sectors that should know better. But at the same time, I feel compelled to try to recount history so that people who may not know can make an adequate assessment of forces, because basically that's what's missing nowadays. I mean, people try to take actions without doing an analysis of the forces. And if you're taking action without doing an analysis of the forces, in a sense, you have to depend upon being lucky if you're going to prevail. And even if you work hard, I'm not sure if luck is enough, but as the baseball announcers like to say, it's quite strange that the harder I work, the luckier I get.
You've been doing a lot of scholarship that goes against the grain, and I've seen the way folks can react to things like your Counter-Revolution of 1776 book, for instance.
Oh, yeah.
Because it's so...
the 1500s book, that's what I'm excited about now. That's the one I'm writing now. It's... because basically the story of settler colonialism in North America, in the present-day United States, does not begin in Virginia in 1607 or in New England a few years after that. In terms of settlements, you could say it begins in St. Augustine, Florida in 1565, and then in what is now New Mexico by the 1590s. And even in terms of what many are marking now in terms of the arrival of the Africans in 1619, of course, the Spanish had brought enslaved Africans to what is now South Carolina in 1526. But, of course, they rebelled and dispersed, and with their Native American allies, chased the Spanish back to Santo Domingo,
right,
and to Havana. And so I don't think you can get a real fix on settler colonialism if you're starting the story decades after it actually began.
Now, your history here, it goes all the way back to the Wilson administration and even earlier than that in terms of American interaction in Southern Africa. And this is a monumental volume. It's close to 850 pages of the actual text, and the footnotes are extremely detailed. What are some major reflections or thoughts that jump out at you about this period?
Well, once again, my mental space is now being occupied by the 1500s. And I just wrote a line yesterday that London was willing to fight Spain to the last Dutchman. That is to say, if you really look at the history of capitalism, even though London gets credit in turn for capitalism and republicanism, which is then taken to a new level by the settlers who vote in North America, it's actually the Dutch who were the pioneers in revolting against the Habsburgs, which of course included Spain in the 1500s. And of course, Protestantism, in terms of this religious conflict, was prevalent in both Holland and in England. And of course, Queen Elizabeth was supporting the Dutch against the Spaniards. But in some ways, as and to be fair, other historians have pointed out, basically, London was using the Dutch as sort of a heat shield. I mean, even though Spain, as you know, tried to invade England in 1588, and the Spanish Armada and got turned back or was not able to succeed. Of course, there were decades. I mean, the Dutch were fighting the Spaniards for decades with London's support. And of course, if you were a betting person in, say, 1620 or 1630, you might have put your money on us sitting here in North America speaking Dutch. And of course, that brings us to the Dutch going to the southern tip of Africa in 1652, and then opening the door for the arrival of French Protestants, the Huguenots, who play a key story, a key role in both my 1600s book and in my 1500s book. I think I said in my 1600s book that the French Huguenot elite took to slave trading like whales to water. And of course, they were incorporated into the ruling elite of South Africa. The Afrikaners are not only descendants of the Dutch, they're descendants of the French Protestants, the Huguenots, which is why you find this surname, Duplessis, so common in Pretoria. But what's interesting to fast forward is that, of course, by the beginning of the 19th century, the British basically take over South Africa from the reeling Dutch. And then after the Haitian Revolution, 1791 to 1804, Britain, as you know, becomes this abolitionist power, decides that the jig is up with regard to slave trade and slavery, because you can not only lose your investment in enslaved Africans, as the French found out in Hispaniola, but you could also lose your life. And then that leads them to abolish slavery in their possessions in the Caribbean, and then, of course, in Southern Africa as well. And that leads to the so-called Great Trek. And you might recall that I use that term Great Trek to describe what happens when the Africans chase the settlers out of Jamaica and the Caribbean, and they make the Great Trek to your neck of the woods, in Rhode Island, for example. I'll never forget when I was in the Redwood Library in Newport, Rhode Island. It's a great library, by the way. Have you ever been there?
Personally, I have not.
It's a great library. You should go there. It's named after Thomas Redwood, who was a Caribbean slaver and slave trader. And, the Africans chase him out of there. He winds up in Rhode Island on his great trek. But I won't digress too much on that. But back to Southern Africa. And so then the Afrikaners, that is to say, this fusion of the Dutch and Huguenots, they make a great trek in the 1830s to try to escape British jurisdiction, which they are not able to do. And finally, this leads to the so-called AngloBoer War of the late 1890s, in which many U.S. nationals go to fight on behalf of the Afrikaners, just as in North America, where the settlers revolt of 1776, the Africans generally did not stand with the settlers. The same held true in Southern Africa or South Africa in the 1890s. The Africans generally did not stand with the settlers. They stood with London. And what's interesting, of course, is that not only many of these folks, Euro-Americans, going to South Africa to fight with the Boers or the Afrikaners, but as well, we all know the sordid story that even after the Afrikaners are defeated, there's a kind of kissing and making up with London, even though F.W. de Klerk is amongst the Afrikaners. He's, of course, the last apartheid ruler, who says that there was no event more searing in the history of the Afrikaners than their defeat at the hands of the British. And, of course, one of the themes of my book is that the Afrikaner elite in many ways, were faking the funk when it came to white supremacy. What I mean is, let me clarify this very quickly, they were interested in Africana supremacy. The United States has done a fair job, and underline fair, of integrating these various European ethnicities and nationalities into the synthetic whiteness. Of course, there have been many, shall we say, bumps in the road with anti-Catholicism of the 19th century, and of course in the 20th century as well, anti-Semitism of the 19th century and the 20th century and the 21st century as well. But there was much more success in creating a so-called white identity, militarized identity politics, to use the term from my Apocalypse book, was much more successful in North America than in South Africa, because one of the reasons why the Afrikaners basically had to give it up in 1994 was they were just so hostile to their fellow European settling in South Africa who had roots in the UK, not to mention being hostile to immigration from other parts of Europe, not to mention being anti-Semitic, which is a major theme of my book, which of course helps to drive many Jewish folk into the arms of the South African Communist Party and the African National Congress, with Joe Slovo of Lithuanian Jewish descent being a leader of both the ANC and the SACP. So, interestingly enough, as I point out in the introduction to this book, a U.S. diplomat counseled the South African elite that they had three choices. This is the 1920s. They could assimilate, that's to say, intermarry with the Africans, which of course was a non-starter. They could migrate. They could leave, which is of course what Charlize Theron, the Hollywood star, and Elon Musk, the alleged billionaire, have done. Recall that he's this founder of the Tesla electric car company, and SpaceX, and the Boring Company, and other ventures headquartered in Southern California. Or they could do what their comrades in North America did. They could exterminate. That is to say, it was like these European invaders exterminated indigenous populations in North America. The Europeans in South Africa could exterminate the Africans. They made a start in that direction, but for various reasons were not able to succeed. And footnote, I published a review that just was printed the other day of a book by Howard University professor K. Wright Lewis, A Curse Upon the Nation. It's in the Journal of the Civil War era. And it's a book about extermination in North America. And she details the Native American groups that are no more because they were liquidated by these invaders. And then she talks about the various attempts to exterminate the Africans, even though the Africans were producing so much profit. But of course, the Africans, in turn, were trying to get rid of the slave owners. And so the slave owners thought that they had a good reason to try to exterminate the Africans. It's a very interesting book. And I give it a positive review, and I've been talking it up since that review was printed.
Fascinating. You bring up a lot of interesting things that seem to offer commentary on contemporary domestic and international affairs. And I know you were actually very deeply involved in solidarity with South Africa as an activist, as well as doing first legal work and then historical work. I wonder what your thoughts are, because you also at one point interviewed Yasser Arafat of the Palestinian movement, and we see today solidarity movement forming, and well, it's been active for years and years now, but it's reaching into consciousness of even the liberals in some sectors. So my question is about the fact that the geopolitical lay of the land, so to speak, is different because while there certainly are the Arabic world allies and the global southern allies of the Palestinians, there is not a global northern so-called superpower such as the Soviet Union on the side of the Palestinians anymore.
Yeah, that's true. But as an optimist, hopefully not a naive optimist, I would like to think that we are on the cusp of a Copernican change in the international situation with the inauguration of this trade war with China, which I think may have come too late for U.S. imperialism. The time to inaugurate the trade war might have been 2005 or 2006. But now I'm not sure, particularly in light of the meeting that took place it's taking place as we speak, between President Putin and President Xi. President Xi said that Putin is his best friend, his BFF. And, of course, President Xi was accompanied by a delegation of thousands strong to this economic forum in St. Petersburg. And I was just watching on C-SPAN this forum that took place. I'm speaking to you from Washington, here in Washington at the Brookings Institute just a few days ago, where they were talking gloomily about a possible war with China and Moscow. Obviously, this would be a nuclear war, which could really mean a bad day for us all. But in any case, I would like to think that we're on the cusp of a dramatic change, particularly in light of the fact that the 45th U.S. president, like a drunk in a bar, he wants to take on all comers. Trade war with China, trade war with Mexico, threatened sanctions against the European Union. Of course, he sees the European Union as sort of a German front group, basically. Trade war, threatening sanctions with Japan, even though Japan did everything except lavish him with kisses during his recent visit. And so I think that U.S. imperialism might be, despite the wars that it's been losing steadily in recent years, it still might be overstressing and overdetermining. The fact that it has this military and spends more on the military than the next 6 or 7 powers combined. And I would like to think that the ground is shifting underneath the feet of U.S. imperialism, which would be a great leap forward for humanity. But again, as the 45th U.S. president might say, we'll see what happens.
The role of the African American centers of intellectual thought you mentioned was a very plus and minus instance. We had, on the one hand, some great leaders like Robeson, both the Du Boises, Patterson and Davis, taking on some significantly positive roles. And then, unfortunately, the Cold War changed the dynamic significantly. And do you see any of those patterns emerging these days in terms of activism during this nightmare of the Trump administration? Or
well, I would like to think so, but I have to say, once again, I have to talk about something that happened today. And I mean literally today. David Brooks' column in the New York Times this morning. Did you see it?
I unfortunately did not, but...
Well, it's interesting. David Brooks, of course, is the conservative columnist for the New York Times. But there's bad news and good news. Actually, the bad news is the good news, and the good news is the bad news. What I mean is that his column this morning shows that in some ways, David Brooks, the conservative columnist in the New York Times, is to the left of a good deal of the U.S. left. which is, I mean, I know that this guy just gone through a divorce, he's going through a midlife crisis. But still, I mean, and let's not talk about what that says about the U.S. left when a conservative New York Times columnist is more progressive than they are. The column basically it does not accept the creation myth of the founding United States of America. This is more or less, this is a paraphrase, if not a quote. It says the country begins with a crime, that is to say, the expropriation of the Native Americans, and then continues with an atrocity, which is what happens to the Africans. And until folks come to grips with that, it's almost like I thought he was going to write no justice, no peace. I mean, and of course, you know, many of our friends on the left, they still into the creation myth. I know that they were bludgeoned into accepting the creation myth because, you know, it is in the United States. If you don't accept the line, you know, you get, you know, they may kill you. You know, certainly they'll reduce your income. But still, I mean, most still accept the creation myth. And another sign in that regard is that Sean Willens, the Princeton professor, wrote this book, No Property in Man. It's really sort of trying to revive the creation myth of the founding United States. And in the current issue of the New York Review of Books, this British historian basically explodes that thesis. And so I'd like to think that there's firmness in certain intellectual circles, and given the United States and given that this is the heavyweight champion of white supremacy, oftentimes I'm afraid to say that if there's going to be change and ferment, it seems that somebody who is defined as white, or particularly white conservative, you have to depend on the white conservatives to lead the left, basically. And so this column by David Brooks in the New York Times, you should read it. It's very interesting.
Certainly. And I can think immediately of instances where it's been the most unexpected so-called white conservatives, whether it was Lyndon Johnson signing into law the various civil rights and domestic welfare state measures, despite being what would have been called a Dixiecrat.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Yeah, well, I mean, as I said, the United States, I mean, nobody likes to admit it, at least, well, I won't say that. That sounds too Trumpian. Few people like to admit it. But it's just like, you know, George Will, the conservative columnist for the Washington Post, he has this new book out, which is really, it's ludicrous. It's ridiculous. It's basically trying to bring us back to January 2017. That is to say, I'll give David Brooks credit. I mean, he mentions explicitly that the advent of Trump really should cause people to rethink what they thought they knew about this country. And I think that that's true. Whereas George Will, he doesn't want to rethink. I mean, he's basically trying to go back to January 2017, before this long national nightmare began. And that's a non-starter. And quiet as is kept, I'm afraid to say that some of these people who are pumping up Joseph Biden are also trying to go back to January 2017, as if you could do that, and you know, as if Trump did not happen. And they don't want to analyze Trump. They want to almost see him as some sort of anomaly or some sort of nightmare.
Exactly.
When actually, you know, he flows from the fiber of this so-called republic. People need to come to grips with that. And to his credit, as I said, I think David Brooks is trying to come to grips with it. And as I said, given the fact that oftentimes, you know, people don't want to listen to you in this country unless you're defined as white, unless you're conservative, I think it's noteworthy, this column this morning, which I hope I'm not overdetermined.
Mm-hmm. Are there any other points you want to bring up, either about this South Africa book, the work you're doing on colonial history in America, or other points in closing?
Well, you know, I have this book. It's supposed to come out today, so hopefully it'll be out by Monday. Jazz and Justice, Racism and the Political Economy of the Music. And it's a movie that deals with this, movie. It's a book that deals with this music we call jazz, tracing it from the late 19th century up to the present. I spent a lot of time talking about the political economy, particularly organized crime, which then brings me, I have to say, I'll conclude with this. I'm doing this book on boxing now, and boxing and organized crime. And what's interesting about both books is that the Negroes were always trying to develop these organized crime families, which is understandable, given the fact that organized crime has played such a major role in this territory. I mean, what were slave traders and pirates, but gangsters, for example. But what kept happening was that the Italian-American and Jewish-American organized crime families had so much clout in the police department and in the district attorney's office, they would squash their Negro competitors. In fact, I'm doing a special study of organized crime in Philadelphia. And what's interesting about organized crime in Philadelphia, number one, is that so many of these guys, they come out of the police department and the district attorney's office. I mean, really, literally.
Wow.
And then they migrate into organized crime and then into boxing and all these other enterprises. And I'm still in the early stages of this project. I'm sure you recall the Ali Frazier fight.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so Joe Frazier is really close to organized crime in Philadelphia. He was even close to Mayor Frank Rizzo of Philadelphia. I don't know if you're old enough to remember him, but he was like the Bull Connor of Philadelphia. I mean, he took great pride in beating up Negroes because he was a former cop, you see.
Gotcha.
Whereas Ali represents this attempt through the Nation of Islam initially, and then through Don King, who, as you know, has, shall we say, organized crime connections, to develop a situation where rather than being exploited, rather than being, you build these black entities to challenge mainstream organized crime families. And in fact, before Don King, there was Truman Gibson, who was a black American lawyer, graduate of the University of Chicago in the 1930s, who was really, he was a Don King who didn't get paid. That is to say, he was basically running boxing, except he didn't get paid. I mean, Don King got paid, to put it mildly.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a very interesting story about Truman Gibson. I've got to track him down. I'm going to Chicago in a few days because he was from Chicago to try to track him down. So anyway, this boxing project is what I'm working on now as I try to write this book about the 1500s.
The following has been produced as part of a crowdfunding campaign for the website Washington Babylon, edited by the investigative journalist Ken Silverstein. If you would like to support Ken's investigation, visit patreon.com/DCBabylon. That's patreon.com/DCBabylon.
It's common to find corrupt members of Congress. But Senator Marco Rubio, really, I can't think of anyone dirtier. Going back to his early days, his brother-in-law, as I recall, was a coke trafficker. And young Marco, as a teenager, used to, as I recall, walk the dogs and mow the lawn of the brother-in-laws. The thing is, you could say, well, he was just the dog walker or the lawnmower, but this was a major coke trafficker, and little Marco never noticed anything funny. I mean, they were dealing a ton of, well, I don't want to say 2,000 pounds. It probably was more. I don't really know. It was a major drug trafficking operation, and little Marco was too goddamn stupid to notice anything, or maybe he did notice something, and they paid him, $100 an hour to walk the dogs? I mean, I can't answer that question, but that's one of the things I'm going to be looking at. There are so many. He has a long-time association with one of the most crooked individuals in the state of Florida. And when you say one of the most crooked individuals in the state of Florida, I mean, I don't even know what compares to that. I mean, in the city of New Orleans, I mean, in the city of Chicago, in the outer circles of hell, David Rivera, they are long-time party friends, love to party, love to go out on the town and have a good time, love to consort with lobbyists. He's a family man, so I would not want to cast aspersions on he or Mr. Rivera. However, if one were to do a Google search, one would find some very interesting things. I've written a few things about Mr. Rubio. I won't call him Senator Rubio. That's a degraded term as it is. But this is a guy who, I wrote a story for the New York Observer. Anybody can Google my name, Marco Rubio, and I did a few stories, but one in particular will come up about his real estate transactions, where, let's just say he obtained his first house. I think he had 3 houses. I can't remember how many lady friends. Just friends. I mean, not saying they were girlfriends or lovers. I'm just saying they were intimate companions. Good family man. So I wouldn't want to suggest in any way there was more than that. But you can read my New York Observer piece where he declined comment on anything having to do with how he obtained housing, his homes very, 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 very cheaply, and always managed to make money on these real estate transactions where campaign donors or bankers he knew or people who might, again, I don't want to cast aspersions, but people who might want favors from Mr. Rubio helped him out. There was a crooked doctor involved in one of these transactions, a Medicare fraudster. He's got a lot of interesting friends. And he had no comment about this. I mean, if I were called and said, are you a crook? And do you like to party with David Rivera? And do you have some intimate lobbyist female companions? I don't care personally what people do in their private lives, but if you're a U.S. senator, as Mr. Rubio is, a lot of what he does has the appearance of impropriety. So I'll be looking into the dirty, dirty past of this man, but I'll be also focusing on his disgusting role as the chief cheerleader and sponsor of the attempt to overthrow the government of Venezuela. I mean, I would say the 3 most powerful individuals all should be rotting in jail cells are Rubio, John Bolton, and Elliot Abrams. And Rubio was there first. I mean, Trump ultimately bears responsibility for the criminal sanctions that are punishing the people of Venezuela, strangling the country, and not harming the leadership. And no question, there is serious corruption among the leadership in the Venezuelan government. I mean, that's not even open to question. However, they're not hurting President Maduro in any way. I understand why the Venezuelan people are tired and exhausted, and they are not happy necessarily with President Maduro. But I have been to Venezuela a few months ago, and I'll be going back as part of my reporting, in addition to going down to Florida. So we very definitely need to raise some money for this story. The situation there, I'm not going to say it's 100% the cause of the United States, but you read newspaper stories where they say the people are starving. Well, the government does give a monthly food basket to everybody in the poor areas, which is most of the country. I saw it with my own eyes and wrote about it at Washington Babylon, Caracas Chronicles. If you Google that and Washington Babylon, you'll find this story. You'll find pictures. I was in the poor areas where I was, fed, well taken care of. I'm not going to say Venezuela's a paradise? Of course it's not. It's a very difficult situation. It's complicated, but if there's any man who is evil in regard to his conduct towards Venezuela, it's Marco Rubio. I mean, you have to sort of wonder, because he's, famously, his family were Cuban fascists, anti-Castro, but I don't know why he's got a hard-on for Venezuela. I mean, and this is one of the things I'll be looking at. Something's there. Maybe he took some dirty money, speculation, of course, from a Venezuelan businessman close to the government and got burned on the deal. I don't know what his obsession is. And lastly, I am also going to be focusing on his best friend in Venezuela, Leopoldo Lopez, praised in the U.S. media as a hero and a freedom fighter. I can guarantee you this guy is going to look very, very ugly when I'm done with my reporting. His family is extremely rich. They own a lot of property. I don't believe all that property was obtained legally or that they've disclosed the ownership of it. And Leopoldo Lopez is a party goer just like Marco Rubio. Marco used to mow the lawn for coke traffickers. I don't know. I mean, I've just heard stories. It may have just been NyQuil, but, from what I understand, Mr. Lopez, the Trump administration's bitch in Venezuela, and Marco Rubio's God knows what, potentially a business partner, who the hell knows, they are not going to be happy with what I report. That's what I can guarantee you. I can't guarantee you I'll uncover every stone and find every fact, but I will guarantee you that Marco Rubio, Donald Trump, John Bolton, Elliot Abrams, and Leopoldo Lopez are going to be pissed off when they see my reporting. All I'm looking for is $1,200 because I know everybody's pressed for money. That's not even going to cover my costs. I'm looking for money elsewhere. I'm trying to find a sponsor that'll pay for my plane ticket to Venezuela. I mean, there's $1,200. The expenses aren't going to come close. I got to go to Florida. I'm happy to do it. It's going to be a great reporting trip. Down to Miami, possibly Tallahassee, and to Caracas. So that's not going to be, at $1,200, I'm going to lose. But I'm going to raise other money, and we'll publish some great stories at Washington Babylon, and I'll probably publish a few stories elsewhere to make money, because I got to hustle. Because, as you know, journalism is not the most profitable profession unless you are, like a lot of our U.S. journalists, not terribly critical or skeptical or honest. And that's, the fastest route to success. But we try to do a little bit better at Washington Babylon.
Preceding has been produced as part of a crowdfunding campaign for the website Washington Babylon, edited by the investigative journalist Ken Silverstein. Music credits are as follows. The songs Hacienda and Akari were produced and distributed by the website Filmstro, while The Internationale was produced by Jerry Engelbach. All music has been used in this package on the basis of properly recognized and adhered to licenses with their creators. If you would like to support Ken's investigation, visit patreon.com/DCBabylon. That's patreon.com/DCBabylon. Thanks for listening, and be sure to tune in next week. This is the Washington Babylon podcast, hosted by Ken Silverstein and produced by Andrew Stewart.